I think in general, a lot of people just get really downright uncomfortable when we talk about grief and loss and death.
I want to welcome in my listeners. I know you have been eagerly awaiting part 2 of this podcast special featuring our grief therapist, Bethany Godwin. A whopping 90% of my audience stated that they wanted to hear from her, so here we go. I want to thank her for joining us here yet again, and I know many of you enjoyed part 1. I want to caution everyone that listens to this episode, it will have a heavy emphasis on loss, grief, and trauma. So if you feel this episode may be triggering to you, please feel free to turn it off. This episode is intended to help educate my listeners on the benefit of loss and grief therapy. It has been a tremendous help for both my husband and I. I know that I have impacted my audience in a positive light through sharing my loss and grief journey, and I've been trying to be as real and as raw as possible with you all. You guys are not alone, and I know many of you are hurting, of course, from different forms of loss and grief. I am trying to use my pain and turn it into a purpose. We will all sadly experience loss and grief throughout our lifetime. Some of us will experience it many times. The loss of a best friend, a pet, a loved one. I mean, the list just goes on and on. Or what about the loss of identity? A job loss, moving to a different location, a recent breakup. There are many forms of quote unquote loss in general. But for the sake of this very episode, again, we will be focusing on child loss and grief. Although to some extent, I will argue that after losing a child, many of you probably experienced some form of identity loss with it, right? Like the loss of being a parent, a caretaker. I know that I went through some form of identity loss because I was like, what the heck? I thought I was supposed to be a mom. I was getting ready to go on maternity leave. I thought that I was going to be learning how to breastfeed and do all of these things. So I definitely went through the whole loss of identity, and I'm still struggling with that to this day, 5 months or 6 months into my healing journey. So let me toss this question out to Bethany. And I know we've already kind of talked about it in episode 1, but we'll touch upon it again. I've brought it up a few times since my loss. Why are we not taught at a young age how to deal with loss or grief? Even though, again, it's typically something that we all encounter.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great question. And I think over the last couple years, I feel like especially with COVID, that really, like a lot of us were experiencing like loss of someone or just, grief with our normal lives. I think we started to talk about it a little bit more. So I'm hopeful for some changes in the future. But I think in general, a lot of people just get really downright uncomfortable when we talk about grief and loss and death. I think it just brings up a lot of uncomfortable feelings, pain, sadness, and also vulnerability. There's a lot of vulnerability that goes into this experience. And so people a lot of times are not feeling as comfortable to be vulnerable in that. And there's not necessarily a way to fix it. We have to learn how to live with it. I know we've talked about before, especially, having the loss of a child, it's not something that's ever going to go away. Even if you go on to have other children, you're still going to have that loss for that child and that grief for that child. And so we aren't able to take it away. Right? Like we have to learn how to live with it. It will be there forever. And that's really uncomfortable to a lot of people. We want that like quick fix or that fix to move on, right? And feel better with it. So I think those are some factors that play into it. And I think too, it is a very diverse experience for people. People feel in lots of different ways about grief and the loss of someone. And so sometimes that can be a little hard because the way it feels for one person feels totally different for another. So it can be hard sometimes for people to find like common ground on it or to feel like it's a safe place for them to express their experience with it.
That is a perfect answer. And it kind of segues perfectly into my next question, which is how do you feel families can teach kids and young adults about loss and grief before it actually happens? That way they have the mental tools and resources to seek help prior to the chaos of actually losing someone or something close to them. And the reason why I asked this question is I had never really thought about this before, right? Like kind of like Bethany and I discussed in part 1, where like you have grandparents and like you experience people passing away, and if they pass away and you go to the funeral, people cry a little bit, they hug, the cards stop coming in, the flowers stop coming in after like a month or two, and people just like go on with their lives, which to some extent, rightfully so. Again, I understand that like life has to continue, but at the same point, like people don't really ask how you're feeling anymore after like that first 2 to 3 weeks. People just go on with their lives. And I'm noticing that a lot more now going through the loss of my son. It's really just my very close friends will check in on me, or other women that have experienced a similar loss will check in with me. Because again, and I understand everybody's lives continue and they're moving on with their own situations. But I remember when I first went through this situation, I never really knew how to process grief or loss. So I guess to kind of segue into my original question, Bethany, how do you think families can start to teach about loss and grief, and where can they learn these like mental tools and resources before a chaotic situation actually happens?
Yeah, so I think, I don't work with kids, but I've had a lot of parents who over the years have kind of asked that question of like, I don't know like what to do, with my kids when I'm dealing with this grief or this loss, right? Like how do I work with them on it? And so I think that there's a lot of fear that comes up in parents to talk about this with kids, because it's almost like they don't want to like burst the bubble, right? And to make them maybe like have to grow up really quickly by learning about sad things and difficult things that exist in the world. So I think that that can be really hard. And I'd say it can be hard because I'll say on one end, we can do some preparation and some like kind of groundwork laying before a loss happens. But I'd say another part of it is there are parts of it that you can't plan ahead for, right? It's like you have to be experiencing it to really understand it and to get it when it happens. There's a little bit there of, yes, we can definitely do some work around just emotions, right? Like coping, things like that. But also it just is very unique when you have a loss in the family and maybe like a young child that's experiencing it. There's a lot of great resources out there. There's Sesame Street actually offers, I'm going to try to pull it up right now to remind myself of it, but it's like Sesame Street Communities, I believe it is. Yeah, sesameworkshop.org, I believe that's what it is. Sesame Street has lots of different topics on there that you can click on to get some help with, maybe some videos that are in like child language or different handouts for parents that can be really helpful. So that also helps have something tangible for children to understand. And so I think that that can be really helpful for parents. Then there's also the National Alliance for Children's Grief. That is a great website. It's nacg.org. That's a great website that has a lot of other resources, articles, videos, education for parents with just how do I talk to my kids about this? How do we cope with it? That type of thing. Those are two great resources that I offer for a lot of people. But, parents will often ask me, like, how am I supposed to act in front of my kid? They're afraid a lot of times to show that emotion or show sadness in front of the kids. And what I tell them is, it can be very healthy, freeing, and effective for you to show emotions in front of your children, with as long as you have some things in place that they feel safe, that they feel like you are able to cope. If they start to feel like they don't have security, or they're concerned that you are not able to cope or function or provide that safety and security for them, then that's when it turns more into the unhealthy expression of emotions in front of kids. And there can be a lot of concerns with that. There was one day I was looking at some pictures of my grandparents, and I, had some little tears flowing, and my child walked into the rooms, and it's just like, I have to just acknowledge and say, I'm just a little sad. I'm looking at, pictures of my grandparents and I really miss them, right? But I'm okay, and I'm working with it, or I'm talking to somebody, or, whatever you want to say, right? You can acknowledge that you have emotions and feelings, but you also reassure your children that you are doing something to take care of yourself. That's the important thing to think about when you're talking about expressing emotions in front of your kids. It's also really freeing and normalizing to them to say, hey, it's okay for people to cry. It's okay for people to feel sad or to miss someone. That can be really helpful for them to know that they feel permission to be upset, permission to have feelings about that. Because when they feel like they can't show it, or they feel like they show it and then you get really anxious about it and you're like, oh, it's okay, don't cry, don't be upset. They feel that anxiousness, and what that's telling them is, then I've got to stop doing whatever I'm doing because they can't handle it. So being a container for your children is really important too when it comes to emotions and grief and things like that.
Thank you for sharing that, because again, I have these thoughts running through my head. The second this started happening to me, it kind of just dawned on me that I was never taught these things or really spoken to about these topics. And again, now I'm trying to bring awareness to it. So having somebody on here here like Bethany to speak about it openly and to have you all listen in on the fact that there are ways to open up that dialogue and start conversations lightly with your kids. Obviously, you probably don't want to do it at age 2 or 3 unless something happens.
Right.
But maybe when they turn 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, and you're over there watching a movie like Lion King, which is one of my favorite movies of all time,
Mhm.
and you see
Mhm.
Simba crying over his dad's body as he's passing away. And that's a perfect
Mhm.
example to pause the movie and kind of explain a little bit of what's happening. That whole movie is kind of about the circle of life. Bethany is speaking about there are certain websites like Sesame Street, it sounds like, offers some resources for you. So go ahead and look into it. And I think that it is great to teach kids about loss and grief because, again, at some point, sadly, everybody will experience loss and grief. And whether it's a pet, a parent, a grandparent, the list goes on and on. As we
Mhm.
continue discussing loss and grief, before we get heavy into it, I want you guys to all learn a little bit about Trellis. Trellis is the spot that Ryan and I started receiving our grief therapy from Bethany. I remember sitting in the hospital and they started handing me a bunch of information, and Trellis was one of those resources. And their website is trellissupport.org. Again, that is TRELLIS support.org. I'm just going to pull up their website really quickly and just read some information from their actual website for you. So just give me a brief second to pull that up. I'm reading from their grief counseling page. And again, they have a number of different resources and tools on their actual website, but this is titled Grief Counseling. We know that this is a challenging time, which may feel especially hard if you are grieving the loss of a loved one. Read below for information on our grief counseling services, including individual and grief support. We have also created a resource page with you in mind. Mourning the death of someone you love takes time. Your heart and your mind need to find their way in their own time. Grieving is a deeply personal and gradual experience. The counseling we offer is about recognizing where people are in this process, helping them identify their strengths, and assisting them in developing ways to cope. I wanted to point out Trellis because, again, that's how Ryan and I met Bethany. We are very grateful that we met her and that we are familiar with Trellis now, because in the event that we have something else happen to us, God willing, I hope not. Like, I don't think my heart can take anymore in this point in time. But we since then have sent other people in the area to Trellis and have told people about Trellis. So it's one of those things where I feel like sometimes God gives things to you so you can kind of help others. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why, sadly, I hate to say it, I think Ryan and I might have lost our son, is to bring awareness to the situation. And with that, it's us bringing purpose to our pain. But I want to talk a little bit more about Trellis. And before we even get into Trellis, I know that Bethany shared a story with me lightly in therapy. And I want to first point out and thank Bethany. Bethany is freaking so sweet. You guys know me, like, I'm very natural. Like, I like to have conversations with people and I like to like ask questions. So there were times where I would kind of like ask her questions here and there, even though I was supposed to be in there for my own therapy. But there were times where, like, naturally I'm like, okay, like, I wonder why she started working here, or did she lose somebody? Like, how did she find out about Trellis? I want to thank her for answering my questions lightly, even during my own therapy. With that being said, the reason why I'm mentioning it is during one of my sessions, Bethany actually opened up to me and mentioned that at one point she lost her dad, and that's how she actually found Trellis and why she also works there, and or I don't know if she volunteers or works there. Bethany, go ahead and share your story. You could give as little detail or as much detail as you wish.
Yeah. So, Trellis and how I got connected to me is a really special story, and it's part of my, like, finding purpose with pain, kind of like you mentioned. Kind of mentioned earlier that in my grad school program, I thought I wanted to go into school counseling and everything. When I started my grad program, my dad was actually diagnosed with cancer, and he battled cancer for about 2 years. And so in the summer after me finishing grad school, he did pass away. And we came involved with Trellis through him. And so it happened really fast towards the end. And so we didn't get as long with Trellis as we might have, liked to have. He was transported to the Kate B. Reynolds Hospice home on campus. And so he passed away at Trellis. And about a month and a half or so later, because we had been connected with them, I found out about their grief counseling. And I'd actually, with my practicum or my internship supervisor, had mentioned a volunteer volunteer opportunity at Trellis for that summer. Thankfully, they didn't have a spot that I could help in because that would have not been a great time. But it actually kind of put it on the radar for me of what they did offer as far as like getting connected and helping with them and everything. I went to grief counseling for a little bit there, went to a workshop one time. Trellis to me is just a really great resource for the community where people just get it. I think, grief is something that can feel really isolating. You feel like nobody understands, nobody gets it. So to me, going to Trellis, the people that are there, you feel like people understand it and you don't have to explain. And the things that don't make sense in grief make sense to them, right? So it feels like a really safe space. Trellis offers each summer Camp Carousel. It's a program that they offer for kids and for adults, and it looks a little different for each one, but it's basically like a grief camp, where you go and you learn about grief, you learn about how to cope with it, different things that you can do to work with your grief and different experiences. And so I volunteered, I think it maybe been about a year and a half or 2 years after my dad passed, and I volunteered with them, and I just instantly fell in love with it because I felt like, oh, I get it. Like, I understand this part from my own experience, but then I also have this like professional training that I've had and knowledge. And like, this could be where I feel like there's this purpose, right? And you have this pain, you had this experience. What are you going to do with it now? I really, enjoyed working with them. And so it's been, off and on for about 10 years now. I've helped them in different areas. So volunteering with kids, I've always done that. And then about a year ago or so, or maybe it's been 2 years. No, it's been 2 years. I had the opportunity to come on as PRN. I work there in a small setup, basically, where I work there a few hours here and there, where I see clients or I'll hold a workshop and things like that. But it's really meaningful work to me, and I really appreciate being able to have that opportunity. It's just very rewarding, and it really helps to feel like, okay, there's a reason for what I've gone through and what I can do, and being able to help other people in that manner. It's really just kind of that, full circle kind of moment.
I thought it was important for us to both kind of talk about how we got involved with Trellis, just because, again, I had never even heard about Trellis until we went through our situation with the loss of Jordan. And to know that there is something local like a Trellis for those that are kind of like scrambling to get assistance, I think is absolutely fantastic. And with that being said, I know I've kind of talked about it a few times, but I'll give you guys like the basics of it. When I was at the hospital, bawling my eyes out, my head was spinning, not knowing where to turn and feeling all alone, I was told that I could go to Trellis. I was handed a bunch of different pamphlets and whatnot. One of the pamphlets that was actually handed to me was for something called Star Legacy Foundation, which specifically is a foundation for women that have lost their child to stillbirth. Recently recorded a 2-part podcast special with the founder of that foundation, and I am so looking forward to dropping that content for you all as well. But on top of all these pamphlets and whatnot, again, I was told about Trellis to help with my current mental health state. So I jumped at the opportunity, and I knew that it would be helpful. I knew opening up to somebody like Bethany about my loss would be painful, but I also knew that only a therapist at that time would be able to see things from an unbiased point of view. Like, I truly knew that I needed somebody to not be one of my parents, to not even be my husband, to not be a sister, because they don't know how to handle those types of situations. They probably would have just done the typical, oh, let me give you a hug, or here's a box of tissues, or I'm sorry for your loss. It's like, at that time, and even still hearing, I'm sorry about your loss, it's not helpful. Like, I don't want to sit here and laugh about it, but honestly, when you're going through something so traumatic, such as a child's loss, hearing things like that, and I know people mean well, but it is just, I don't know, in my opinion, not helpful at all. So being able to sit out and sort out your emotions and talk through things, even if you sound like a train wreck, are more important than just holding in that trauma and that stress, because I know I talk about this a lot on this podcast as well. If you hold in that trauma and that stress and repress things, that can turn into bodily issues. Like me, I know I've been experiencing clenching of my jaw, or crossing my arms, or like not sleeping properly, or having weird dreams. I know that a lot of that is a result of like the stress and trauma, not only on my body, but mentally, what the heck happened to me. So working through that all the time is very helpful. And again, doing that with somebody like Bethany has been fantastic. Once again, I trusted that Bethany would help us get out of that that traumatic pit that we were sinking in. And trust me, months later, at times, I still feel as if I'm in a pit of quicksand. I'm learning that grief obviously ebbs and flows. There is no end. Bethany and I have been talking about this, right? Sadly, there's no end to grief and loss. There's good days, there's bad days, and I'm just learning how to cope and heal. I remember I said this little saying to Bethany, and she's like, I kind of like that. Maybe I'll start using it. Learning to be comfortable with the uncomfortable is one of the biggest things that both Ryan and I are learning to deal with, is straight up learning to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because I remember when this first happened to me, we'd be going out to dinner and I would start bawling my eyes out in front of everybody, and people probably thought that Ryan and I had just got into a fight. Little did they know, like, I had just given birth 6 weeks prior, and I was just trying to enjoy our 1-year wedding anniversaries. I don't know. I can go on and on and on about it, but learning to become comfortable with the uncomfortable has been something I'm still struggling with. What was your initial reaction to having 2 young lost parents like Ryan and I coming in to see you?
You know, I'll be honest, you guys were the first couple that I've worked with. I've had a lot of women that have come in and we've worked with pregnancy or infant loss. And I've even offered, for their spouse or partner to come in if they wanted to for a session, but no one had actually done that before. And so, when I first started doing this work, I was a little intimidated and I was a little afraid of not saying the right thing or saying something wrong or not being as helpful. I was a little nervous when I first started. And then for you guys to be the first couple, I wasn't really sure. I was like, I'm going to try to hopefully do right by this. Okay. I really want to make sure that I'm here to support both of them and try to help them with navigating this together as a couple, making sure that both are feeling heard and feel like both are able to get something from therapy. So it was definitely a first experience, but a great experience for me to be able to work with you guys, because you guys have just been so wonderful to work with.
Thank you for sharing that. And obviously, I had no idea that we were the first couple that you worked with. But for me, I'll kind of explain to you guys why we decided to go together as a couple. And again, grief, loss, therapy, it's individualistic. You can go alone, you can bring whoever you want, I guess, if you so choose to bring somebody else with you, no matter what your therapy session is. For me in particular, I wanted my husband to be there because not only did I want him to talk about a little bit of what he was going through, because I feel like so many times the men tend to hold their emotions in, like they're very inward about it. Not every guy, so I don't want to single everybody out, but I feel like most men are more inward with their emotions, whereas women are more outward with their emotions. So I wanted him to be able to talk a little bit about what he was going through and help him work through his emotions, because he too, right? Like, he just lost his firstborn son. He was in that delivery room with me. He watched me bawling my eyes out, and he was the one changing my diapers after going through the whole birthing experience. He had gone through this experience with me, and I wanted him to be able to heal alongside me, in the sense that if he didn't necessarily want to go through the therapy, I at least wanted him there to listen to Bethany. That way he can relate to me. If I'm sitting in the corner bawling my eyes out or crying, he knows to kind of either just ask me and leave me alone, or if I'm talking to her and I tell her that I need reassurance in X, Y, and Z type of way, that he would know how to respond to me. So I felt like it was important for my husband to be in that room for the both of us, but more importantly, to help support me when I needed it, because I knew that I was going through such a shitstorm of feelings and emotions. What do you feel about my choice to have my husband in there with me?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think that, like, for each couple, it can be just really different on that's something that's helpful or not. But I think that the relationship, right, can be unfortunately affected in a really difficult way when you have an experience like this. And a lot of times, you're right, of if the spouse is not getting that education or that information or that place to process that stuff as well, they can't be as helpful to the other spouse, or they figure out, how do we work on this together, right? Like, how do we cope with this together? So it's definitely really important. And I wish that more couples would try to do this together to get some type of support. There may be some instances where within the couple, they have their time together as a couple, and then they also have time individually with their own counselors. Then that may be the most effective for them. So it can look different, but I think that it's important for the couple themselves to get some type of support together, because there's just a lot to navigate there. And if we don't help them to navigate that together while they're going through it, there can be some issues within the relationship relationship for sure.
I 100% agree with you. And kind of like Bethany just spoke about, at some point, the couple may decide to kind of go their own route with therapy. I'm kind of at that point now. I'll talk about my own personal journey where Ryan is kind of, I think, okay with just doing his own thing and talking to friends and family about it and going and crying or grieving in Jordan's nursery or playing video games or whatever his outlet is. Whereas I've been talking to Bethany about potentially coming to see her myself for getting ready and prepared, God willing, for pregnancy after loss. I know that I'm going to be going through a whole other mental hoop of craziness when it comes to potentially conceiving after going through such a traumatic loss. I don't think my husband necessarily wants to go to therapy for that, but I do know that I will, after each session, go home and tell him, whether it's with Bethany or whoever I decide to work with, have him understand what I'm speaking about and talking about. That way he kind of knows how to put out those fires when I'm going through things and the therapist is not around. Because kind of like Bethany and I talked about in episode 1, she hit the nail on the head when she said therapy is a lot of the times like temporary, and they also are not around 24/7. You can't have your therapist like on call 24/7. So you need to have other outlets and tools like going for a walk, having a support group, meditation, some other type of self-care, and having your partner or family members knowing how to help you with that self-care, I think is important. I want Bethany to kind of talk about, I don't know the exact terminology, she'll give you the exact terminology for it. When we first walked in, and I will tell you guys, I was literally like an emotional wreck. I'm sure you can understand why, right? But I had like the box of tissues there. I was very wobbly leg. I looked like a freaking limp noodle. I wanted to be there, but I kind of wasn't really ready to talk about what had just happened, but I knew I had to rip the Band-Aid off. And I'm very grateful that I did, because I probably wouldn't be healing like I am now had I not started talking about it. But I remember walking in that room, Bethany was very sweet and kind, and she had this, I'm going to call it an emotion board. She'll give you the actually terminology for it, but it's like this big board. It almost looks like a glacier on it, and it tells you the different levels of emotions that you go through, different traumatic experiences, like through the shock and becoming numb. And eventually you get to a point where you're kind of not healed from it, but at like a level of acceptance. So Bethany, can you talk about what exactly you went through with us when explaining all those different emotions?
It's a chart specifically that Trellis has called the experience of grief. And so this chart was developed by a man named Jack Cicero, and he based this off of William Worden, who's a psychologist, the 4 tasks of mourning. If we look at grief theories, a lot of times you will probably hear somebody quote off to you the 5 stages of grief. I don't love that model, because the lady who developed that, she was basing that off of interviews with terminally ill patients who were anticipating their own death. It can be a lot of times people will quote that to me and say, well, I'm in this stage, so I must be going next to this stage. And grief is not linear. It is up and down. It is side to side. It is all over the place. The experience of grief, the chart that it shows, it has lots more emotions than just those 5 stages. It kind of at the top, it talks about acknowledging the loss, experiencing the pain, readjusting to the loss, reinvesting in emotional energy, and then reconciling the loss. And then under each of those different columns is lots of other feelings. I know in that first meeting, we talked a lot about under acknowledging the loss, there's shock, there's disbelief, confusion, anxiety, panic, anger, guilt, lowered self-esteem, preoccupation, or we're just hyper-focused on what's happened, retelling the story, loneliness, sadness, despair, right? There's so many different things there. I love the chart, and I use that with a lot of clients because I think it's just helpful to show how it's so much more than just sadness. Because a lot of times I think people think that grief is just sadness, and it's so much more than that. So when we use the chart, we're helping give them a name to these different feelings and experiences, which helps them feel less, I feel like I'm going crazy, a lot of people say, or I feel like I'm losing my mind, or I must be doing this wrong. And we help them to see, no, this is what it's like, and these are the different things you'll go through. And I talk about a lot of times how you can go forward and backwards with this. It doesn't mean that you're regressing. It doesn't mean that you're not doing this right. It just can change a lot of times. I found the chart to be really helpful, and I'm glad that you guys did too.
Yes, I definitely did find find the chart to be very helpful because for somebody that's visual, like my partner and I, and again, I understand not everybody is visual, but actually be able to see kind of where you're at in that chart, grief and loss, you ebb and flow. There's times even now, and I'm in month 5 or 6 with it, where I'm doing okay. And I'll use that loosely, right? Because I'm never going to be fully okay again. And I understand that. And that's just like such a shitty mindset to have to like sit with. But at the same time, I can't do anything about it, right? So it's kind of like, how do you move forward at the same time, honoring and remembering your loved one? And in my case, my son, Jordan. But at the same time, like not being stuck in the mud, because if you're stuck in the mud, you're also not living and enjoying your own life, and you're not enjoying the people that are around you living. So like that's something that I'm learning to deal and cope with. Is I remember one of my best friends, she said to me, I don't know how you're doing so well with this. And I literally looked at her and I said, because if I stay stuck in this mud and I just sit and cry every day, don't dig myself out of this hole, I'm doing my own self a disjustice. I'm doing my husband a disjustice if I'm not being productive in society again. And I do understand everybody grieves in a different way. So if you are somebody that needs that 3 or 4 months in bed, take it. But I also suggest not just laying in bed all day. You need to get up and go for walks. And the reason why I'm saying that is, for me, it was a struggle. The first 2 months for me after I lost my son with the postpartum hormones and things like that, it was work just getting the hell out of bed to eat breakfast and to take my dog on a walk. Things that I typically love doing. I love taking my dog on a walk. I love eating breakfast. I love the sunshine. Here I am 5 or 6 months later. I have to almost like force myself to grieve, because if I don't sit down sometimes and think about my loss and go into the room and cry and play a song that makes me think about my son, my trauma response comes out in other ways. Like I talked about earlier, like I'll clench my jaw while I'm sleeping. Never did that before. Or I'll be crossing my arms or twirling my hair a little bit more. These nervous little tics are coming out, and I recognize that that's my body's response to the trauma. So I know I have a lot more healing to do. And I guess I'm being open about this because in my own situation, that's what I'm dealing with. But I know all of your situations that you are dealing with individually could be different. Bethany, do you have any top tips for those dealing with loss of a child and how to handle that grief in a healthy manner?
You know, the loss of a child is just, there are so many different presentations from people about this or experiences with this, a lot of different factors that play into it. But I think, a common question I will get from people is like, is this the like normal way I should be feeling? Or like, am I normal, right? Like, am I very different from other people? Or like, what's the right way I'm supposed to be doing this? I think, just giving yourself that permission and that freedom that your grief is just what it is. So like kind of like I mentioned in the first episode about being observational, of just being observational, that like that is what your grief is, not trying to control it, not trying to make it be a certain way, but just letting it like kind of organically happen as it is, because it's just going to be so unique for everybody. And I would say also, especially with the loss, when we're talking about pregnancy or stillbirth or infant, very young infant, you also need to remember that you've got a lot of the physical aspects that you're having to deal with in the midst of your grief. So you're healing physically, and that is going to vary depending on at what point you were in your pregnancy or how long it had been since you'd given birth. But that also adds a whole nother layer onto it. So like, you've mentioned before about the hormones, right? Being aware of that you have hormones that are happening in your body that are readjusting. Your body is trying to readjust. Your brain has undergone a lot of changes with pregnancy and maybe birth and postpartum. And what can also be difficult too is innately, right? Like primitively, your brain is really having a hard time with understanding that your brain was changing and everything changing in your body to be paying attention to and connected with a baby to care for. And if you are no longer able to be caring for that baby, that is a very, very deep pain, and that is very, very difficult to navigate. So you may have a lot of these like natural urges that you are not able to engage with because your child is not there with you. So it's very, very delicate. And there's just a lot of other things to consider that are happening outside of another type of loss. I'd say another thing too that I talk about regularly with moms or with parents is, unfortunately, there can be a lot of, with that social layer, that social support, a lot of barriers there and obstacles. So like you mentioned, people just saying really unhelpful things where they're trying to be helpful, but they're not. Or something I've run into a lot with women of childbearing years versus you may have a friend who is also pregnant at the time that you are dealing with this, or dealing with someone being around children. It may bring up a lot of pain and difficulty there. And so you may not be able to have that support and connection with that friend who's maybe typically been someone that's been supportive because they are pregnant or they are dealing, they have a child, and that might be too much at that time, right? So a lot of, I think, women can feel like a cut off from that social support that they might have. And that might be another layer that they're trying to navigate is, well, then where do I have that support? Because that would have been the person I would have gone to, but there's these obstacles there. And there can even be where women feel like they're judging themselves. Some women might say, like, I'm a terrible person. I can't be happy for them right now. Or I can't, just talk to them because I'm, feeling jealous of what they've got going on in their life. I think a lot of it is just letting yourself feel the feelings you're feeling, because it all makes sense. And you won't always feel that way, but that's how you feel right then. That would probably be the things that I would say the most to people when they are dealing with this type of a loss.
Understanding your boundaries when you're going through something like a child's loss.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, again, I'll speak on my own behalf. And I know some other women that I've become friends with through social media and whatnot that have gone through the same exact loss as me around the same time as my husband and I, where we both recognize that it is difficult having to go to something like a baby shower or a child's birthday is difficult because we don't have our babies. I'm slowly starting to know that that's a trigger for me, but at the same time, I don't want to completely avoid these things forever, right? Because I have a handful of nephews in my family, and I don't want to be spending the first 2 or 3 years of their lives avoiding their birthday parties just because I'm hurting. I don't know. For me personally, and everybody can handle things their own way, I'm the type of person that's going to tackle this stuff head on. I know it's going to be a trigger. I know it's going to be painful, but whether I do it now or I do it 3 years from now, that pain is going to always be there. So I might as well just start working on it now and chipping away at that ice cube. If you have something frozen in an ice cube and you have to start chipping away at it until you actually get to the center of that ice cube, or licking a Tootsie Pop until you get to the center of the Tootsie Pop. I kind of feel like that's how my healing has been lately, where it's this is going to suck. I have to just do it or else I'm going to be missing out on things. At the beginning, I tried to avoid birthday parties and baby showers and whatever. Honestly, not even going to see my nephews. I've been finding it to be healing, where recently I just went to Florida for 4 or 5 days. And I found it very healing for me because one of my best friends, I've known her for about 15 or 16 years. She has a almost 3-year-old baby girl, and she has a 5-month-old little boy. And it makes me teary-eyed, but it was very sweet for I know, and as I get teary-eyed and I talk about it, it was very sweet for Ryan and I to be able to hold her son, because I can't even tell you guys the amount of times that I said to my husband, "Oh, babe, this is so cute. This is the age that Jordan would be." In that respect, it was hurtful, but also healing to see. Hopefully that's us in the future. But I don't know if Bethany can talk about that a little bit. I know we're going to wrap up episode 2 soon, but in your opinion, Bethany, do you think it's more beneficial to chip away at that ice cube right away, or wait a little bit until you're ready to do so?
I think that this is the really hard part. This is the real gray area of grief that I think a lot of times, I've explained it lately to people, it's like dipping your toes in the ocean and you don't know if it's too much until you're doing it. It could be that you have that gut feeling where you're I'm not in a good place right now. And then one day you get to this point and you're I think maybe I could try it. And then if you try it and then you're nope, definitely not, it's too much, I'm not ready, then listen to that, but if you're okay, you're saying, I think the hard part is with grief, we have a lot of where it's painful, but it's also helpful at the same time. And that feels really weird to think about, that those two exist at the same time until you're in grief and then you get it. I think, if you kind of dip your toes into it and you're it hurts, but it's also I think it can be helpful, then just go with it. You start to learn yourself and you start to trust yourself again when you're going through grief. Whereas I think in the very beginning, a lot of it is you don't trust yourself because you are feeling so much different than you've ever felt before and you don't recognize yourself. But something shifts one day. We don't know when that is, but you can tell when it happens. Okay, I think I'm starting to trust myself now.
100% agree with that. And as we start to wrap up episode 2, we've been talking about so many different helpful topics that I know my listeners are fully enjoying getting to learn from you. So thank you for coming on here. Types of grief therapy. There is individual, that whole one-on-one situation like my husband and I did with Bethany. There's also workshops, groups, and so much more that you can choose from. What do you suggest for someone that has recently just lost a child? And I know that is difficult to answer because, again, we've been saying over and over and over again, loss and grief is very individual and it's what that person is comfortable with. So I guess given all the different options out there, individual workshops, groups, and more, how would somebody be able to choose what they think might be good for them to start with?
I think when it comes to this particular type of loss, it can be really important to have your individual work. So, because there are parts of it that are so intimate and so vulnerable, having that like one on one with someone is really important. I think also group work can be really helpful because it helps you to see that like you're not alone. You can hear other people in their experience. But there's a certain point when you feel like you're open to be able to hear other people's stories. Sometimes it can be too much to hear other people's stories, and you're just not in a safe space for that just yet. One of the ways I feel like a lot of women I've worked with have tapped into that like group connection, but not like full fledged into it, is there's a lot of these like community boards, with the world of internet that we're in now. There's community boards, there's like a Facebook page or, some type of a online where you're hearing from other people and they're like sharing their experiences. You're not in live time with them, or you don't like see their face or like hear from them, right? Their explanation of their story. But it feels like, oh, okay, like this person said this and I relate with this. So I think that those can be helpful for a lot of people. And podcasts can be really helpful because you can pace it, with if it feels like it's helpful or if it feels like it's too much, but you're still able to hear like that other people are experiencing this too.
Different ways to find resources, guys. We've kind of been talking about this throughout the last 2 episodes. Do a simple Google search and you'll find all different types of tools and resources. And I hope that you have been finding my episodes helpful. Again, not all of my content is going to be loss and grief themed, but I feel like lately a lot of it has been because that is the quote unquote season that I am currently in. I will note though that even when I conceive in the future, one of my missions will be to continue talking about this and bringing awareness to it because like we've been speaking about, right? Like this loss and grief journey is going to be something that's with me forever. And I also want our future living children, whenever that does happen, to understand and to remember that they do have a brother in heaven. And I guess I'm encouraging you guys to kind of do the same, where if you are going through something similar, to bring awareness to it. And it doesn't have to necessarily be through like a podcast like I'm doing, but helping other women or other families, I think, is very impactful. Any last words, Bethany, for those that are dealing with a significant loss and how they can help heal and cope in a healthy way?
I would just encourage anybody that's dealing with any type of loss, you're definitely getting support around just understanding grief and how to cope with it and having an outlet to express your feelings about this. It's not that we are looking for a solution to it to take it away, but having someone to sit with you during it can be really, really helpful because grief is something that is an all-consuming experience. It typically will affect every area of your life, right? So it can feel really like it's been turned upside down. That's a lot to deal with, adjust to cope with. A lot of people will feel like there's a supposedly right way to do it, or if I'm doing it wrong. And so getting some support around that can be helpful to help affirm what you're doing and what you're feeling and what's working for you. And it's a discovery kind of experience because you learn along the way what's working for you or more about yourself and how you feel about things. It is, quote, a lot of times we call it a natural experience, right? But natural doesn't mean easy, and natural doesn't mean seamless. And obviously, when we talk about pregnancy and infant loss, that really doesn't feel natural, right? It's a really deep, all consuming experience. So just get support out there so that you don't feel alone in this.
And I'm going to have you leave the listeners with some words of wisdom. I like to call this positive pop. So for my OG listeners that have been tuning in since basically day one, some years back, you guys all know that I love my special guests to leave you all with some positive pop. And Bethany, that can literally be anything, like what gets you motivated in the morning. I don't know if it's like a good cup of coffee, or if you like to have like a mimosa, going for walks with your dog like you talked about in episode 1, or giving your significant other a hug, or journaling. What is your positive pop?
That is a good question. Let me see. I would say your experience is your experience. I think that would be what I would say because we can a lot of times judge it, right? But if we take empowerment and like that's how we're feeling and that's who we are, then we can feel more confident in that's what's happening, right? It's not right or wrong. It just is the way it is. So I think that's what I would say.
That's some beautiful positive pop. And Bethany, you were a fantastic guest. Thank you so much for joining me on here. And I would love to get you back on here again. in the future, maybe sometime down the road, especially if I get to continue seeing you in office, and maybe we could talk about pregnancy after loss, if and when, God willing, that does happen. I do think my listeners would appreciate hearing from you off and on, especially talking about what you have going on and twilight counseling and all of those good things. One last time, go ahead and shout out your private practice, because maybe some people might want to work alongside you.
Yeah, thanks. It's Twilight Counseling.